Certainly. Here's a compelling third-person true lifestyle story outline in 5 parts, based on your title. Title: Elderly nun blocked from playing piano. Then she played and astonished the world. Part 1. The Silent Keys. Sister Mary Agnes, a 78-year-old nun at the quiet St. Brigid's convent in rural Ireland, had once been a gifted pianist in her youth. But decades ago, following a crisis of faith and a vow of humility, she stopped playing entirely, locking away her talent along with the convent's aging upright piano. The instrument sat untouched in the chapel annex, its keys gathering dust. When a new, pragmatic Mother Superior arrives and deems the piano a distraction from prayer and chores, she orders it removed. Sister Mary Agnes pleads quietly but is overruled. The piano is scheduled for donation, its music seemingly silenced forever. Part 2. A Whisper of Memory. One rainy evening, while cleaning the storage room where the piano now waits for pickup, Sister Mary Agnes lingers. Memories flood back, her childhood recitals, the joy of Chopin at dawn, the way music once felt like prayer made audible. On impulse, she lifts the fallboard and plays a single phrase from Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata, softly, as if afraid God might hear. A young postulant, Sister Claire, overhears from the hallway and is stunned by the depth and precision of the playing. She secretly records a short clip on her phone, moved beyond words. Part 3. The Unexpected Broadcast. Sister Claire, believing the world should hear this hidden gift, uploads the clip to a local community page with the caption, "Our 78-year-old nun hasn't touched a piano in 50 years, until tonight." Within days, the video goes viral, shared by classical musicians, news outlets, and millions captivated by the raw emotion in Sister Mary Agnes's playing. Offers per in, concert halls, television appearances, even a record label. But the convent is divided. Some sisters worry about vanity and distraction. Others see it as divine providence. The Mother Superior, initially stern, begins to reconsider. Part 4. The World Listens. After much prayer and consultation with her bishop, Sister Mary Agnes, humbly and reluctantly, agrees to one public performance, a charity concert for a children's hospice. Dressed in her simple habit, she walks onto the stage of Dublin's National Concert Hall. The audience falls silent. She plays a program of sacred works and classical masterpieces, her fingers trembling not from age but from awe. The performance is transcendent, hailed by critics as a miracle of restraint and revelation. Donations flood the hospice. Sister Mary Agnes donates all proceeds to the convent's outreach programs, refusing personal gain. Part 5. A Legacy in Every Note. Though she returns to her quiet life at St. Brigid's, everything has changed. The piano remains, not as a relic of vanity but as a tool of ministry. Sister Mary Agnes now teaches music to local children and leads weekly contemplative piano sessions for the sisters. Her story inspires documentaries, books, and even a scholarship for elderly artists rediscovering their gifts. At 80, she records a modest album titled Grace Notes, which tops classical charts. But in her heart, she remains unchanged. A humble servant who once thought her music was over, only to discover it had merely been waiting for the right moment to bless the world. Let me know if you'd like this adapted into a full narrative or adjusted for a specific audience. In the quiet countryside of Western Ireland, where rolling green hills melt into misty horizons and stone walls crisscross the land like old lace, there stood a small convent called St. Brigid's. It wasn't famous. No grand spires, no crowds of pilgrims, no glossy brochures. Just a modest cluster of whitewashed buildings surrounded by gardens, a chicken coop in the steady rhythm of prayer work, and silence that had shaped the lives of the sisters who lived there for over a century. Among them was a woman most people simply called Sister Mary Agnes. She was 78 years old, with silver hair tucked neatly beneath her veil and hands that bore the gentle map of time, knuckles slightly swollen, skin paper-thin, but still steady. She moved slowly, not from frailty but from habit. Decades of rising before dawn, sweeping stone floors, tending vegetable patches, and folding laundry had taught her the value of calm, deliberate motion. To the younger nuns, she was a quiet presence, kind, always ready with a warm cup of tea or a listening ear, but never one for long stories or loud laughter. Few knew that, Long before she took her vows, music had been her first language, not the Latin chants she now sang in chapel, but the rich, flowing language of piano keys, how a single note could carry sorrow, how a chord could bloom like sunlight through clouds. She'd grown up in a seaside town not far from Galway, the daughter of a schoolteacher and a fisherman. Her father had saved for 2 years to buy a second-hand upright piano, its wood scratched, one pedal sticky, but to her it was a palace of sound. By age 10, she could play folk tunes by ear. By 16, she was performing Chopin and Debussy at local recitals, her fingers dancing across the keys with a grace that left audiences breathless. But life, as it often does, took a sharp turn. In her early 20s, after a personal loss that shook her to the core, she walked away from the stage, the applause, the sheet music stacked on her desk. She didn't just stop playing, she buried it, deep. She entered the convent not to escape music, but because she felt she no longer deserved its beauty. She believed joy had to be earned through sacrifice, and so she gave up the one thing that had always made her feel closest to something divine. For 50 years, she never touched a piano, not once. The convent had one, an old, slightly out of tune upright tucked in a side room off the chapel, used only for Sunday hymns decades ago. But when the last sister who could play passed away, the piano sat silent. Dust settled on its lid. Moths nested in the felt hammers. The keys yellowed like old teeth. Still it remained, a ghost of a past no one spoke of. Sister Mary Agnes avoided that room. She'd take the long way around during her chores, eyes down as if the instrument might call out to her if she passed too close. Sometimes, on still nights, she'd dream of scales and arpeggios, of playing Beethoven's Pathétique with such fire that the windows rattled. She'd wake with her heart pounding, then cross herself and whisper a prayer for forgiveness, for wanting something so earthly. Then, everything changed with the arrival of a new Mother Superior. Her name was Mother Catherine, and she was different from the gentle, soft-spoken leaders who'd come before. She was in her late 50s, sharp-eyed, practical to a fault, and deeply committed to what she called purposeful simplicity. She believed the convent should focus only on prayer, service, and self-sufficiency. No distractions, no relics of vanity. Within weeks of her arrival, she'd reorganized the kitchen schedule, canceled the weekly poetry readings, too indulgent, and replaced the flower garden with extra rows of potatoes. One crisp autumn morning, she called a meeting in the refectory. The sisters sat on wooden benches, hands folded. As Mother Catherine stood at the head of the long table, a clipboard in hand, "We've been blessed with this home," she began, her voice calm but firm. "But we must not confuse comfort with mission. Every object here should serve a clear purpose. If it doesn't, it becomes clutter, and clutter clouds the spirit." She paused, scanning the room. Then she said, "The piano in the chapel annex will be removed next week. It hasn't been played in years. It takes up space we could use for storing blankets for the homeless shelter. I've already arranged for it to be donated to a community center in Cork." A soft rustle went through the room. Several sisters exchanged glances. No one spoke. Disagreement was rare and rarely voiced, but the air grew heavy. Sister Mary Agnes felt her stomach drop. She kept her eyes on her hands, folded tightly in her lap. Her throat tightened. She wanted to speak, to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. What could she say? "I used to play? It means something to me?" That felt like pride, and pride had no place here. After the meeting, she went straight to the garden, pulling weeds with more force than necessary. Her mind raced. She told herself it was foolish to care. The piano wasn't hers. It hadn't been touched in decades. Let it go. Let it serve someone else. But that night, lying in her narrow bed beneath a thin wool blanket, she couldn't sleep. The image of men coming to carry the piano away, strapping it onto a truck, driving it down the winding road, leaving nothing but an empty space and dust motes in the sunlight, filled her with a quiet, aching grief she hadn't felt in years. The days passed quickly. Boxes appeared in the annex. The piano was covered with a faded sheet like a body prepared for burial. Sister Mary Agnes avoided the hallway altogether. She volunteered for extra kitchen duty, scrubbed floors until her knees ached, recited extra rosaries, all to keep her mind occupied. But fate, or perhaps grace, has a way of nudging us when we're not looking. On the evening before the piano was scheduled to be picked up, A storm rolled in from the Atlantic. Rain lashed the windows, wind howled through the eaves, and thunder rumbled like distant drums. Power flickered, then went out. Candles were lit. The sisters gathered in the common room, sharing stories by firelight. Sister Mary Agnes, however, slipped away. She told no one. She just needed air, or so she told herself. But her feet carried her not to the garden, but to the chapel annex. The room was dark, lit only by a sliver of moonlight through the high window. Rain tapped gently on the roof. She stood in the doorway for a long moment, heart pounding. Then slowly she stepped inside. The sheet was still draped over the piano. She reached out, her fingers trembling slightly, and pulled it away. Dust swirled in the dim light. She ran her hand over the lid, feeling the familiar curve, the cool wood beneath her palm. It was like meeting an old friend after a lifetime apart. She lifted the fallboard. The keys stared back at her. Ivory yellowed with age, some chipped at the edges. She sat on the bench, its cushion flattened by time. For a full minute she just stared at her hands as if they belonged to someone else. Then, almost without thinking, she placed her right hand on the keys. She didn't plan to play anything grand, just a note. One note to see if it still sounded true. Her finger pressed middle C. The note rang out, clear, warm, slightly flat, but alive. It filled the small room, bouncing off stone walls, mingling with the sound of rain. Tears welled in her eyes. She hadn't heard that sound in 50 years. Before she could stop herself, her left hand joined in. A simple phrase from Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata, the opening slow and haunting. Her fingers remembered what her mind had tried to forget. They moved with a memory deeper than thought, shaped by thousands of hours of practice long ago. She played softly, barely above a whisper, as if afraid someone might hear. But in that moment, it wasn't about being heard. It was about remembering who she had been, and who, perhaps, she still was. She didn't notice the door creak open. A young postulant, barely 20, stood in the shadows. She'd been looking for a misplaced hymnal and had followed the faint sound of music down the hall. Now she stood frozen, eyes wide, breath caught in her throat. She'd never heard anything like it. It wasn't just the skill, it was the feeling. Every note carried a lifetime of silence, longing, and quiet strength. Sister Mary Agnes played for only 2 minutes before stopping abruptly, as if waking from a dream. She snapped the fallboard shut, heart racing, cheeks flushed with shame. She turned and saw the young woman. For a moment, neither spoke. Then the postulant whispered, "That was beautiful." Sister Mary Agnes looked down, shaking her head. It was nothing, just an old habit. But the young woman's eyes shone with something like awe. "You have to play again," she said softly. "People should hear this." "No," Sister Mary Agnes said quickly, firmly. "It's not for show. It never was." She stood, smoothed her habit, and walked out, leaving the piano alone once more in the dark. But something had shifted. The silence that followed wasn't empty anymore. It was full of music waiting to be heard, and though she didn't know it yet, the world was about to listen. The next morning, rain still dripped from the eaves, and the air smelled of wet earth and wood smoke. Life at the convent returned to its usual rhythm. Bells rang for morning prayer, porridge simmered on the stove, and the sisters moved through their tasks with quiet purpose. To anyone watching, nothing seemed different. But inside, everything had changed for two of them. The young postulant couldn't stop thinking about what she'd heard the night before. She'd grown up in a town where music was everywhere. Fiddles at weddings, ballads in pubs, choirs in church, but that piano playing, it was something else. It wasn't flashy or loud. It was deep, like someone speaking straight from their soul. And the fact that it came from Sister Mary Agnes, the gentle, quiet nun who mended socks and watered the herb garden, made it even more astonishing. She tried to focus on her chores, folding linens, peeling potatoes, sweeping the chapel steps, but her mind kept drifting back to those few haunting notes. She'd never seen Sister Mary Agnes near the piano before. In fact, she'd always assumed the old instrument was just furniture, something left behind by a different time. Now she wondered how many other secrets the convent held. At lunch, she sat across from Sister Mary Agnes, stealing glances when she thought no one was looking. The older nun ate slowly, eyes down, as if carrying a weight no one else could see. She didn't speak much, just nodded politely when addressed. But the postulant noticed how her hands rested on the table, still, calm, but with a quiet strength in the fingers. like they remembered something the rest of her had tried to forget. After lunch, while helping in the storage room where the piano now waited under a fresh sheet, the postulant lingered. She'd been assigned to pack winter blankets for the homeless shelter, but her eyes kept drifting to the covered shape in the corner. She waited until the other sisters left, then walked over and gently lifted the sheet. There it was, the piano. Silent again, keys closed like a book. She ran her fingers over the wood, imagining the music that had filled this room just hours ago. Then on impulse she pulled out her phone. It wasn't against the rules to have one. Postulants were allowed limited use for family calls. But using it for anything else felt risky. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that what she'd witnessed was too special to vanish into silence. She turned on the voice memo app, not video, just audio, out of respect. Then she sat on the bench, took a deep breath, and whispered, "Sister Mary Agnes played this last night. She hasn't touched a piano in 50 years. She didn't know if the nun would ever agree to play again, but maybe, just maybe, if she asked gently, would you consider playing just a little?" She asked softly, her voice trembling slightly. Sister Mary Agnes, who had just entered the room to fetch a spare candle, froze in the doorway. Her face went pale. For a long moment she said nothing. The postulant held her breath. Then slowly the older nun walked in. She didn't look angry, just tired, as if carrying a burden she'd long accepted. She glanced at the phone, then at the piano, then back at the young woman. "I shouldn't," she said quietly. "It's not right, but why?" The postulant asked, her voice gentle. "Music isn't vanity. Isn't it a gift? And gifts are meant to be shared." Sister Mary Agnes looked away. "I gave that part of myself up a long time ago. It's not mine to give anymore. But what if God wants you to use it now?" The postulant pressed, not with force, but with the kind of innocent faith that only comes from youth. What if he kept it safe all these years? Just for this moment? The older nun didn't answer right away. She walked to the window, watching rain slide down the glass. Outside, a blackbird sang from a hawthorn tree. The world kept turning, unaware of the quiet battle happening inside this small room. Finally, she turned back. Her eyes were soft, almost sad. "If I play," she said, "it won't be for fame. Not for praise, just for the love of it. And you must promise not to tell anyone." The postulant nodded eagerly. "I promise." Sister Mary Agnes sat at the piano. This time there was no hesitation. She lifted the fallboard, placed her hands on the keys, and closed her eyes. What followed wasn't a performance. It was a prayer. She began with a simple hymn, "Be Thou My Vision," but played it in a way no one had ever heard. The melody floated like mist, each note shaped with tenderness, the harmonies rich and warm. Then, without warning, she slipped into a passage from Schubert's Impromptu in G-flat major. Her fingers, though aged, moved with a fluid grace that defied time. The music swelled and softened, full of longing and peace, sorrow and hope, all woven together like threads in a tapestry. The postulant stood perfectly still, tears welling in her eyes. She forgot to press record at first, so moved was she by the sheer beauty of it. Only when the music reached its quiet climax did she fumble with her phone and start the recording. She captured just under 2 minutes, enough to hold the heart of it, but not so much that it felt like an intrusion. When Sister Mary Agnes finished, she didn't look up. She simply closed the fallboard, stood, and said, "That's enough." The postulant wiped her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. That was like hearing grace made sound. Sister Mary Agnes gave a small, sad smile. "Don't let it go to your head," she said gently. "And remember your promise." "I will," the young woman said, though even as she spoke, a tiny doubt flickered in her mind. Was it really right to keep such beauty hidden? Over the next few days, the piano was scheduled to be picked up. Boxes were stacked around it. The donation center called to confirm the pickup time. Sister Mary Agnes went about her duties as usual, but there was a new quietness about her, as if she'd opened a door inside herself and wasn't sure how to close it again. The postulant wrestled with her promise. She replayed the recording over and over in her head, not on her phone. She hadn't listened to it since that day, out of respect. But in her memory, every note echoed. She knew deep down that this wasn't just for them. This music belonged to more people. But how could she share it without breaking trust? Then an idea came to her. She wouldn't use her real name. She wouldn't show faces. She wouldn't even mention the convent by name. She'd just share the sound and the story behind it, as simply as she could. One evening after Compline, when the house was quiet and everyone was in their rooms, she sat on her narrow bed with her phone. She opened a local community group online, a page where neighbors shared news about lost pets, bake sales, and parish events. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest. She typed carefully. Last night I heard something I'll never forget. An elderly nun who hasn't played piano in 50 years sat down for the first time since she entered religious life. She played like an angel who'd kept her wings folded all this time. I recorded a tiny piece, just 2 minutes, because I couldn't let it disappear. This isn't about fame. It's about beauty that almost got lost. Hope it brings you peace. She attached the audio clip, took a deep breath and hit post. Then she turned off her phone, said a quick prayer for forgiveness if she'd done wrong, and went to sleep. She didn't expect much. Maybe a few likes, a kind comment or two. That was all. But by morning, everything had changed. Her phone buzzed nonstop. At first, she thought it was a mistake. Maybe someone had tagged her by accident. But when she checked, her heart nearly stopped. The post had been shared over 200 times. Comments poured in. Who is this? This is world-class playing. Is this real? Sounds like a professional recording. This brought me to tears. Thank you for sharing. Please tell her the world needs to hear more. Even local radio stations had picked it up. Someone had downloaded the audio and played it on the morning show. Listeners called in asking who the pianist was. The station tried to trace the post, but the account was anonymous. Panic set in. The postulant hadn't meant for this to happen. She'd only wanted a few people to hear something beautiful, not start a wildfire. She went straight to Sister Mary Agnes after breakfast, her face pale. I'm so sorry, she stammered, tears in her eyes. I didn't think. I just posted it on a small group. I never imagined. Sister Mary Agnes listened quietly, her expression unreadable. When the young woman finished, she simply said, Show me. They went to the postulant's room. She pulled up the post on her phone and played the comments aloud. As the voices of strangers, moved, grateful, astonished, filled the small space, Sister Mary Agnes sat very still. Then, to the postulant's surprise, she didn't get angry. She didn't scold. She just looked out the window and said softly, Well, the music has its own will, doesn't it? That afternoon, Mother Catherine called a meeting. Word had reached her through a parish priest whose niece had heard the recording. At first she was furious. Privacy, humility, the convent's reputation. But then she listened to the clip herself. In the silence that followed, something shifted in her too. She found Sister Mary Agnes in the garden, pruning rosemary. I heard you play, she said, not unkindly. Sister Mary Agnes didn't look up. It was a mistake, was it? Mother Catherine asked. Or was it a reminder? They stood in silence for a while, the scent of herbs rising around them. Later that evening, as the sisters gathered for vespers, no one spoke of the recording. But the air felt different, lighter somehow. And when Sister Mary Agnes walked into chapel, more than one sister gave her a small, knowing smile. The piano wasn't taken away that week. The donation center called to reschedule. Mother Catherine told them, We've decided to keep it for now. No one knew what would happen next. But in the quiet hours before dawn, when the world was still asleep, the postulant swore she heard faint music drifting from the chapel annex, soft, searching, full of wonder. And this time, no one tried to stop it. The days that followed felt like living inside a storm that hadn't quite broken yet. Outside the convent walls, the world was buzzing. Inside, everything seemed quieter than ever, but the silence now hummed with something new, something unspoken. The recording had slipped out like a bird from a cage, and no one could call it back. At first, it was just local chatter, neighbors talking over garden fences, shopkeepers mentioning it to customers, a few curious reporters calling the parish office. But then a well-known classical pianist happened to hear the clip on a friend's social feed. He was in his 60s, respected, retired from touring, but still deeply connected to the music world. He listened once, then again, then a third time, headphones on, eyes closed. When he opened them, he wrote a single sentence on his public page. If this is real, it's one of the most honest, moving piano performances I've heard in decades. That post went viral, overnight. The little audio clip was shared by musicians, composers, even a few celebrities known for their love of classical music. News outlets picked it up, First regional, then national. Headlines appeared. Mystery nuns piano playing stuns music world. Hidden talent emerges from Irish convent. 50 years of silence. Then a single song that changed everything. The convent's phone began to ring constantly. Journalists wanted interviews. Radio stations asked for live segments. A major television network sent a polite but persistent email requesting a feature. Record labels, yes, actual record labels, reached out, offering contracts, studio time, even tours. One message simply read, "We'll fly you anywhere. Just play." Inside St. Bridget's, the sisters were divided. Some were uneasy. They'd taken vows of simplicity, of turning away from the world's noise. This sudden attention felt like a crack in their peaceful walls. "It's vanity," one older sister muttered during laundry duty. Even if she didn't seek it, it's still pride to accept it. Others disagreed. "But what if it's not about her?" argued a younger nun who taught music to village children. "What if it's about the music itself? About giving people something beautiful in a world that's so loud and angry?" Mother Catherine listened to all sides. She spent long hours in prayer, walking the garden paths at dusk, her rosary beads clicking softly in her hand. She wasn't against joy or beauty, far from it. But she feared distraction. She feared that the very thing meant to lift spirits might end up pulling Sister Mary Agnes away from the life she'd chosen, the life that had given her peace for half a century. Sister Mary Agnes herself said almost nothing. She continued her chores, sweeping, cooking, tending the herb beds as if nothing had changed. But those who knew her well noticed small things. How she lingered near the chapel annex longer than necessary, how her hands sometimes moved slightly, as if tracing invisible keys in the air, how she looked more tired, as if carrying a weight she couldn't name. One afternoon, the postulant found her sitting alone on a bench beneath the old apple tree, staring at the horizon. She approached slowly, not wanting to intrude. "I'm sorry," the young woman said again, her voice barely above a whisper. "I never meant for all this to happen." Sister Mary Agnes turned and offered a gentle smile. "You didn't do anything wrong," she said. "You heard something true and you wanted to share it. That's not sin. That's kindness. But now everyone wants something from you," the postulant said, her voice tight with worry. "They don't see you. They see a story, a miracle, a performance. What if it hurts you?" Sister Mary Agnes was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "You know, when I stopped playing all those years ago, I thought I was being humble. But maybe I was just afraid that if I kept playing, I'd start wanting things, applause, recognition, a life outside these walls. So I locked it all away and called it sacrifice." She looked down at her hands. "But music isn't pride. It's a language. And sometimes, God speaks through it." The postulant didn't know what to say. She just sat beside her, watching the wind stir the grass. That evening, Mother Catherine called Sister Mary Agnes into her office, a small, sunlit room with a wooden desk, a crucifix on the wall, and shelves lined with well-worn books. She didn't sit behind the desk. Instead, she pulled up a chair beside the older nun. "I've been thinking," she began, "about what this could mean, not just for you, but for us. For the people we serve." She explained that a children's hospice in Dublin had reached out. They'd heard the recording. Many of the children there were facing long, difficult days. Music brought them comfort. The hospice director had written a heartfelt letter. If this nun would be willing to play for our children, even just once, it would be a gift beyond measure. Mother Catherine paused. "They're not asking for fame. They're asking for kindness, and they're offering no payment, no cameras, no interviews. Just a room, a piano, and hearts that need healing." Sister Mary Agnes listened, her eyes distant. She thought of those children, small hands, tired eyes, brave smiles. She thought of how music had once been her refuge, her prayer, her way of saying things words couldn't hold. Finally, she nodded. "I'll do it," she said softly. "But only this once, and only if it's truly just for them." Mother Catherine reached out and gently squeezed her hand. "Then we'll make it happen." News of the upcoming performance didn't leak, not at first. The hospice kept it quiet, honoring the nun's wish for privacy. But word travels fast in tight-knit communities, and soon enough, rumors began to swirl. A few local journalists caught wind of it. A classical music blog posted confirmed the mystery nun to perform live one night only. Tickets weren't sold. The event was by invitation only. Families of the children, hospice staff, a handful of local clergy, But the concert hall where it would be held, Dublin's National Concert Hall, offered the space freely, moved by the story. They even tuned their grand piano specially for the occasion. In the week leading up to the performance, Sister Mary Agnes practiced, not in the convent's old upright, but in a borrowed room at a nearby parish that had a decent instrument. She didn't play for hours, just 20 minutes a day, enough to reacquaint her fingers with the feel of real keys, to calm the nervous flutter in her chest. She chose her program carefully. No flashy showpieces, nothing designed to impress. Instead, she picked pieces that carried peace, a gentle Bach prelude, a quiet movement from a Mozart sonata, a simple Irish lullaby arranged for piano, and because she couldn't resist, the Moonlight Sonata that had started it all. The night before she was to leave for Dublin, the entire convent gathered in the chapel for a special prayer. No one spoke much. They just sat in the candlelight, holding Sister Mary Agnes in their hearts. When the final Amen was said, the youngest sister handed her a small cloth bundle. Inside was a hand-stitched handkerchief, embroidered with a single note and the words, "Play with love." The next morning, dressed in her simple black habit and veil, Sister Mary Agnes climbed into the modest van driven by Mother Catherine. As they pulled away from St. Bridget's, she looked back at the stone walls, the garden, the chapel steeple rising into the gray Irish sky. It felt like leaving home, but also like stepping into something she'd been preparing for her whole life. Dublin was a whirlwind of noise and motion compared to the stillness of the convent. Cars honked. People hurried past with coffee cups and briefcases. Neon signs blinked in shop windows. Sister Mary Agnes kept her eyes down, clutching her rosary in one hand, the handkerchief in the other. At the concert hall, staff greeted them warmly but respectfully. No cameras, no crowds, just a quiet backstage area, a dressing room with a pitcher of water and fresh towels, and a stagehand who whispered, "The piano's ready whenever you are." She walked out onto the stage alone. The hall wasn't full, maybe 100 people, seated in the front sections. Among them were children in wheelchairs, parents with tired eyes but hopeful smiles, nurses in soft shoes, a few priests and nuns from other orders. No one clapped when she appeared. They just watched, waiting. She sat at the piano. The grand instrument gleamed under the soft stage lights. She placed her hands on the keys, closed her eyes, and took a deep breath. Then she began. The first notes of Bach filled the hall, clear, steady, like a heartbeat. And from that moment on, something extraordinary happened. It wasn't just that she played beautifully, though she did, with a touch that made even seasoned musicians lean forward in awe. It was that she played for them. Every phrase was shaped with care. Every pause held space for someone to breathe, to feel, to remember they were not alone. When she played the Irish lullaby, a little girl in the front row closed her eyes and smiled. When the Moonlight Sonata began, a father wiped his eyes without shame. And when the final note of Mozart faded into silence, the room didn't erupt in applause. It stayed quiet, deeply, reverently quiet, for a full 10 seconds. Then, slowly, people began to stand. Not out of habit, but out of gratitude. One by one they rose, tears on their cheeks, hands over their hearts. Sister Mary Agnes didn't bow. She simply stood, gave a small nod, and walked off the stage. Backstage, Mother Catherine was waiting, her own eyes wet. She didn't say anything. She just hugged her. Later that night, as they drove back through the dark countryside, Sister Mary Agnes stared out the window at the passing fields. She felt exhausted, but also lighter, as if a door inside her had finally opened all the way. She didn't know it yet, but the world wouldn't let this moment stay quiet. Within hours, a single photo, taken discreetly by a hospice worker, would appear online. An elderly nun in a black habit, hands on piano keys, bathed in golden light. The caption read, "She played for the children," and the world listened. By morning, the story would explode again, bigger this time. Offers would pour in. Critics would write glowing reviews. Donations to the hospice would flood in from strangers moved by her generosity. But none of that mattered to her right now. All that mattered was the music, and the quiet certainty that, for the first time in 50 years, she hadn't played for herself or for the past, or even for God alone. She'd played for someone else, and that, she realized, was the purest kind of prayer. The morning after the concert, the world seemed to hold its breath and then exhale in awe. Photos from the Dublin performance began to spread. Not flashy paparazzi shots, but quiet, respectful images. An elderly woman in a simple black habit seated at a grand piano, her hands resting gently on the keys, her face calm and focused under the soft stage lights. One picture taken from the back of the hall showed the audience. Parents holding their children's hands, nurses with tears in their eyes, a little boy in a wheelchair gazing up with wonder. That image alone traveled farther than anyone expected. By midday, news outlets across Europe and North America were running stories. Headlines shifted from curiosity to reverence. Nun's piano recital brings Dublin to tears. Music as mercy. Elderly sister plays for sick children. A performance without applause, because it wasn't needed. Critics who usually dissected technique and interpretation wrote instead about feeling. About grace, about how her playing carried a kind of quiet holiness that couldn't be taught. It could only be lived. A famous conductor, known for his sharp tongue and exacting standards, wrote in a national newspaper, "I have heard thousands of pianists in my life. Last night I heard something rarer than talent. I heard truth. Offers arrived faster than the convent's old mailbox could hold them. A major classical label sent a handwritten letter, yes, handwritten, offering to record an album with full artistic freedom, no deadlines, no pressure. A television network proposed a gentle documentary, not about fame but about rediscovery. Charities asked if she'd consider playing at fundraising events. Even the Vatican's cultural office sent a quiet note of encouragement, praising her gift offered in humility. But Sister Mary Agnes didn't read most of it. She had returned to St. Bridget's before dawn, slipping back into her routine as if nothing had changed. She rose for matins, swept the chapel floor, helped prepare breakfast. When younger sisters looked at her with new eyes, full of admiration, curiosity, even awe, she simply smiled and asked how their night had been, or if they'd remembered to water the rosemary. Still, the outside world pressed in. Reporters camped politely at the end of the convent's long driveway. Not shouting, not demanding, just waiting, hoping for a word. Local villagers brought flowers and notes of thanks. One elderly man left a hand-carved wooden music stand at the gate with a note, "For when you play again." Mother Catherine handled most of it. She issued a short, kind statement. Sister Mary Agnes is grateful for the kindness shown, but she remains a woman of prayer and service, not performance. She asked that attention be turned toward the children's hospice and the good work they do. She also quietly arranged for all donations inspired by the concert to go directly to the hospice, every single euro, with no portion kept by the convent. But even Mother Catherine couldn't stop what happened next. A week after the concert, a package arrived. No return address, just a plain brown box. Inside was a brand new digital piano, compact, quiet, with weighted keys that mimicked an acoustic instrument. A note was tucked inside, "For your practice. May your hands keep speaking what your heart knows." A grateful listener, Sister Mary Agnes stood in the hallway staring at the box. She didn't know whether to accept it. It felt like another door opening, one she hadn't asked for. That evening, she went to the chapel annex. The old upright still sat there, its wood worn, its sound slightly uneven. She sat at it, placed her hands on the keys, and played a few simple scales. Then she stopped. She looked around the small room, the stone walls, the single window, the dust motes dancing in the late sun, and realized something. This room had been a tomb for music. But it didn't have to be. The next day, with Mother Catherine's quiet blessing, the new piano was set up in the same spot. Not as a replacement, but as a companion. And Sister Mary Agnes began to play, not for crowds, not for recordings, but for the sisters. For the children who sometimes visited the convent garden, for the quiet joy of it. Word got out that she was teaching piano now. Not formally, not with exams or fees. Just simple lessons for local children whose families couldn't afford lessons elsewhere. Every Tuesday afternoon, 3 or 4 youngsters would arrive, shy at first, then giggling as they learned Twinkle, Twinkle, or a folk tune from their grandparents' time. Sister Mary Agnes never raised her voice. She'd sit beside them, her aged hands gently guiding theirs, saying things like, "Listen to how that note sings," or "Let your fingers breathe between the notes." Parents would wait outside, sipping tea offered by the other sisters, marveling at how their restless, Screen-glued children sat still for half an hour, completely absorbed. Then came the invitation that changed everything. It wasn't from a concert hall or a record company. It was from the Children's Hospice in Dublin. They asked if she'd consider coming once a month, not to perform but to play softly in the common room while the children rested, drew, or talked with their families. "Your music," their letter said, "doesn't just entertain. It gives peace," she agreed. Her first visit back was quiet. She didn't play on a grand piano this time, but on a small upright in the hospice's sunlit lounge. She played familiar tunes, lullabies, hymns, simple classical pieces. Some children listened with their eyes closed. Others colored quietly, their crayons moving in time with the rhythm. One little girl, bald from treatment but full of spirit, asked if she could press a key. Sister Mary Agnes lifted her onto the bench and let her play middle C over and over, laughing each time it sounded. Afterward, a mother hugged her and whispered, "You gave us a moment where we forgot to be afraid." That became her new rhythm. Once a month, she'd make the journey to Dublin. The hospice staff never filmed her. They respected her wish for privacy, but the children remembered. And they told their stories. One of those stories reached a documentary filmmaker, a woman known for quiet, human-centered films about ordinary people doing extraordinary things. She didn't want drama or spectacle. She wanted truth. She wrote to Mother Catherine, not asking for an interview but for permission to simply be there. To film a day in Sister Mary Agnes's life, if she ever felt comfortable. Months passed. Then one spring morning, Sister Mary Agnes said yes. The filmmaker came alone with a small camera and no crew. She stayed for 3 days. She filmed Sister Mary Agnes tending the herb garden at sunrise, teaching a boy how to play Danny Boy, praying in the chapel, laughing with the postulant over burnt toast. She filmed her hands, wrinkled, strong, gentle, as they coaxed music from the keys. She didn't ask for a performance. She just asked, "Would you play something you love?" And so in the empty chapel annex with sunlight streaming through the window, Sister Mary Agnes played Schubert's Ave Maria, not for an audience, not for a camera, just because it was beautiful, and because her heart asked her to. When the documentary aired months later, it didn't have flashy graphics or dramatic music. It was called simply The Quiet Music, and it moved people in a way few expected. Viewers wrote in saying it made them cry, not from sadness but from a deep sense of hope. "It reminded me that goodness still exists," one viewer said. That talent doesn't need to shout to be powerful. The film won awards, not grand international ones but quiet recognitions from film festivals that valued humanity over hype. And with every screening, donations poured into the hospice and into a new fund Sister Mary Agnes had quietly started. A scholarship for older adults, grandparents, retired teachers, widows, who wanted to learn or return to music but couldn't afford lessons. She never took a cent for herself. Every offer of payment was gently declined. "The music is the gift," she'd say. "I'm just the one holding it for a while." Back at the convent, life settled into a new kind of balance. The piano was no longer hidden. It was part of their daily rhythm. On Sunday evenings, the sisters would gather in the annex for music vespers, Sister Mary Agnes playing sacred pieces while they sat in silence, letting the notes carry their prayers upward. Sometimes a local choir would join. Other times it was just her and the wind outside. The postulant, now preparing to take her final vows, often stayed late to listen. One evening, as the last notes of a Chopin nocturne faded, she asked, "Do you ever miss the stage? The big halls, the applause?" Sister Mary Agnes thought for a long time. Then she said, "Applause is sweet, but it fades. What stays is the moment when someone's pain is eased even for a minute by a song. That's the only stage that matters." News of her humility only deepened the world's respect. A classical radio station began playing her Dublin recording once a week, calling it the Peace Hour. A school in Galway named its music room after her, not with a plaque, but with a small painting of hands on piano keys and the words, "Play with your heart." And then came the album. Not because she sought it, but because the label persisted, not with contracts, but with kindness. "We won't change a note," they promised. "Just let us share what you've given so freely." She agreed on one condition. The album would be called Grace Notes, and all profits would fund music therapy programs for sick and elderly people across Ireland. When it was released, it surprised everyone. Not because it topped charts, though it did, even outselling pop stars for a week, but because people listened. Not in the background, but truly listened. Families played it at dinner. Hospitals used it in waiting rooms. One nursing home reported that residents who hadn't spoken in months hummed along to the Irish lullaby. At 80 years old, Sister Mary Agnes found herself not famous but beloved. Not as a star, but as a quiet reminder that it's never too late to offer your gift to the world. And through it all, she remained the same woman who swept floors, folded laundry, and made tea for anyone who needed it, because to her, the music was never the point. It was just one more way to love. Years passed, but the ripples never stopped. What began as a single note played in a dusty room on a rainy night grew into something no one could have predicted. Not fame in the loud, flashing way the world usually measures it, but something quieter, deeper, and far more lasting. Sister Mary Agnes never became a celebrity. She never appeared on magazine covers or gave flashy interviews. But her presence, gentle, steady, rooted in kindness, touched lives in ways that echoed far beyond concert halls or record sales. Back at St. Brigid's, the piano was no longer an oddity. It had become part of the convent's heartbeat. Every Tuesday afternoon, the sound of children's laughter mixed with scales and simple melodies drifting from the chapel annex. The lessons continued, not as a program but as a quiet offering, free, open, and full of patience. Some of the children who first came as shy 6-year-olds returned years later as teenagers, not to play, but to sit and listen, or to help younger ones find their way across the keys. One young man, now studying music at university, brought his own students to meet her. "She taught me that music isn't about being perfect," he told them. "It's about being honest." The hospice in Dublin kept its monthly visits sacred. Sister Mary Agnes never missed one, even when her steps grew slower and her hands sometimes ached in the damp Irish winters. She'd arrive with a thermos of herbal tea and a small bag of homemade biscuits, sit at the piano and play whatever felt right that day. Sometimes a hymn, sometimes a folk tune, sometimes just a few improvised notes that seemed to match the mood of the room. Staff noticed something remarkable. On the days she came, the children were calmer. Pain seemed lighter. Parents held each other a little tighter, but with less fear in their eyes. One winter, a little girl who rarely spoke began humming along to a lullaby. The next month, she asked to try the keys. By spring, she was playing simple songs with both hands. Her mother later wrote to the convent, "You gave her a voice when medicine couldn't." The documentary, The Quiet Music, kept finding new audiences. Schools showed it in ethics and music classes. Retirement homes screened it during afternoon tea. It wasn't flashy, but it was real. And in a world hungry for authenticity, that was enough. A group of retired teachers in Cork started a second chance music club inspired by it, gathering weekly to learn piano, violin, or flute, laughing at their mistakes, celebrating small victories. They called themselves the Grace Notes. And then there was the scholarship. What began as a modest fund grew steadily, supported by album sales and small donations from people moved by her story. It wasn't just for children. It was especially for older adults, people who'd once played as youths but set music aside for work, family, or hardship. A widow in her 70s used it to buy her first piano since her husband passed. A retired farmer learned to play the songs his mother used to sing. Each recipient was asked only one thing: to share their music, however they could, playing for a neighbor, teaching a grandchild, even just singing while they cooked. Sister Mary Agnes never met most of them, but she prayed for them every night. At the convent, life settled into a rhythm that honored both silence and song. The sisters no longer saw the piano as a distraction. They saw it as another form of prayer. On feast days, Sister Mary Agnes would play special pieces during evening prayer. On ordinary days, the sound of scales or a soft melody might drift through the halls as she practiced, not to perfect, but to connect. Even Mother Catherine, once so cautious about distractions, now often paused outside the annex just to listen, a small smile on her lips. The postulant who'd recorded that first clip had long since taken her final vows. She now helped run the music program, organizing the children's visits and managing the scholarship applications. She never forgot the night she'd stood in the doorway, breathless, hearing music rise from 50 years of silence. "You showed us," she once told Sister Mary Agnes, "that it's never too late to begin again." Sister Mary Agnes just patted her hand. It's never too early either. When she turned 82, the local bishop visited, not for a ceremony but for tea. He'd followed her story quietly, touched by how she'd used her gift without seeking anything in return. "You've given the church a new kind of witness," he said gently. "Not with words, but with beauty." She shook her head. "I just played what was in my heart." "That's the rarest thing of all," he replied. Her health, like anyone's at that age, had its ups and downs. Some days her fingers didn't move as quickly. Some mornings she needed help walking to the chapel. But she never stopped playing. Even when arthritis made certain passages difficult, she adapted, simplifying chords, focusing on melody, letting silence speak as loudly as sound. "Music isn't in the fingers," she told a young student once. "It's in the listening," and she listened deeply. To the wind in the trees, to the birds at dawn, to the quiet needs of those around her. She knew when a sister was grieving and would play a gentle hymn without being asked. She knew when a child was nervous and would start with a silly song to make them laugh. One spring afternoon, as she sat at the piano with sunlight warming the room, a thought came to her, not as a plan but as a feeling. She called the postulant, now a full sister, and said, "I think it's time to record one more thing. Not an album, not for sale, just a collection of the pieces she'd played most often for the children, the sisters, the sick, the songs that carried comfort. She wanted them preserved, not for glory, but so others could use them." The local radio station offered studio time. A sound engineer who'd once been moved by her Dublin performance volunteered his services for free. Over 3 quiet days she recorded. No retakes, no edits. Just her, the piano, and the truth of the moment. When it was done, the files were shared freely online. No paywall, no copyright. "For anyone who needs a little peace," the note read. Within weeks, teachers were using the tracks in classrooms for quiet time. Therapists played them during sessions. Families played them at bedside vigils. One nurse wrote, "I played your Ave Maria as a patient took their last breath. It was the gentlest goodbye. That was enough." As the years went on, St. Brigid's became known not just as a place of prayer but as a place where music lived as service. Young women who entered the convent now often mentioned her as part of their calling. Not because they wanted to be like her, but because her life showed them that holiness could wear many forms. Sweeping floors, planting seeds, folding laundry, or playing a lullaby for a child who's afraid of the dark. Sister Mary Agnes never wrote a memoir. She never gave a TED Talk or launched a foundation with her name on it. But her legacy grew in the quietest ways, in the hands of a grandmother learning piano at 75, in the hum of a hospice room filled with calm, in the eyes of a child who discovered that their voice matters, even if it's just one note. When she passed away at 86, it was peacefully in her sleep, after a day spent teaching a little boy how to play Amazing Grace. The convent held a simple funeral as she'd requested. No eulogies, just prayer and music, and at the end, instead of a final hymn, the sisters gathered around the piano and one by one, each played a single note, until the room was filled with a chord that hung in the air like a promise. News of her death spread gently. Tributes poured in, not from celebrities but from ordinary people. A nurse in Belfast, a retired schoolteacher in Limerick, a teenager in New York who'd discovered her album during a hard time. The Children's Hospice planted a small garden in her honor, with a stone bench and a plaque that read, "Here, music brought peace." But the truest tribute wasn't in words or stones. It was in the thousands of quiet moments that continued long after she was gone. Someone playing piano for the first time in decades, a parent singing a lullaby learned from her recording, a nun in another convent starting music lessons for village children, inspired by a story they'd heard. Her life had been small in the world's eyes, no grand stages, no headlines, no empire built. But it had been vast in its kindness. She hadn't changed the world with noise. She'd changed it with stillness, with generosity, with the courage to offer a gift she'd once thought was lost. And in the end, that was more than enough. Because the world doesn't need more noise. It needs more people who are willing to play one true note, even if it's been 50 years since they last touched the keys.